Tom and I are going to present a definition of one tool set called a trust framework. And a trust framework is we think is an important piece of identity systems in that it allows for legal interoperability. So the way I think about it is that our task in constructing identity systems is really to synchronize let's see if I'm getting this right. I have a clicker. I have a green arrow. Okay.
Theory.
There we go. Perfect. Now I've already... Now we've gone too far. So what we want to talk about, again, is synchronizing, the importance of synchronizing identity tools. And by that I mean standards and a code set expressed in software code with a set of governing rules, a rule set expressed in legal documents. So aligning the tools and rules of identity systems, to me, is a really core task. If we do that right, we get trust. And trust here is expressed in terms of the reliability and repeatability of experience in an identity system, whether that's one piece of software talking to another, or an IDP talking to an RP, or a relying party talking to a customer or citizen or consumer. So what Tom and I want to talk about is how do we do this alignment of tools and rules, of getting the legal code and the software code synchronized. And hopefully it's better synchronized
Speaking of synchronization,
than my flicker here. There we go. So today, for those of you that are building identity systems, particularly those at scale, you have a set of options. You all know, and I'm sure there's some lawyers in the audience, that you can create contracts between two parties. The other thing you can do, which is increasingly a default for many large identity systems, and particularly the social networks, is that you have a set of loosely coupled service level agreements. If you, the website or relying party, keep doing this, we'll keep doing what we're doing. So if you look at Facebook and others, they rely on a terms of service and these service level agreements. What we're going to talk about today is trust frameworks, the last of those options, which are really multilateral contracts, and the purpose of our presentation today. Because again, identity systems at scale require a high level of interoperability, both technical and legal, contractual, and between and among standards. And we want to be able to scale. We want to scale at internet scale. So it means that it's one to many. It means that we have potentially thousands of parties to a particular framework, or tens of thousands of websites that are operating in pursuit of a set of legal agreements. And of course, what we want to do is to have trust. And part of trust comes in two ways. One, the transparency, that is that all members of the trust framework can see for themselves what their legal requirements are, what their duties are, what their liabilities are, and also openness. We want the benefit of a trust framework at internet scale allows multiple parties to join the framework without the kind of negotiation and legal overhead that comes from a pairwise or bilateral agreement. So trust frameworks really find themselves beginning to be considered for identity systems at scale. Again, the earlier panel talked about trust frameworks in the healthcare system, in the pharmaceutical system, in the legal entity identity. So why trust frameworks, we'll talk more about, but these are the principal drivers. Our very modest ambition here is to define a trust framework, is for you to be able to leave this gathering with a pretty clear sense of what a trust framework is and what it looks like. And as you can see here, over the last 10 years, there's been lots of different organizations, including mine, which are trying to define exactly what a trust framework is. And Tom and I have set out to do just that. Tom, do you want to just do a quick one?
So when we think about a trust framework, I think we need to start with the general proposition that any multi-party system, whether it's an identity system or a credit card system or an electronic payment system or any other type of system that you might want to think about where there's multiple parties interacting with each other sort of on a random basis. In any system like that, you need rules. You need some rules to make the whole thing work. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about a trust framework. So this is, at its essence, the definition of a trust framework. It's legally enforceable. It's a set of specifications, rules, and agreements, and it governs an identity system. So at its essence, it's a set of rules that governs an identity system that is legally enforceable. And this diagram sort of gives you just a general sense of, we've depicted in the center there an identity system of whatever type you might want to create or be working with. But it's surrounded by a trust framework. It's governed by this trust framework. And so that's the animal we're talking about. Did you have a question? Yes?
I do have a question. I'm a lawyer. And so when you talk about something being legal... Sure.
Sorry about that.
Hi there. Hi there. I do have a question because I think I'm a lawyer, so I know what it means to be legally enforceable. And in my mind, contracts usually talk about in the law contracts being legally enforceable. You don't necessarily talk about rules, or it was rules, contracts, and something else being legally enforceable unless they're part of the contract, right? Specs, rules, and agreements. So unless those rules and specs are somehow part of the agreement, then is that what you're contemplating?
You're absolutely correct, and that's where we're going.
Because as you were saying them, I was thinking, okay, specs, rules, and agreements makes a lot of sense. You want them to be legally enforceable. What you're really talking about is an agreement that's comprised of three parts.
Well,
the terms and conditions, the rules, the specs, the SLA. I mean, you could have yada, yada, yada.
No, you're absolutely correct, and that's one of the issues we're going to talk about is how do you make a trust framework legally enforceable? Contract is one option, regulation is another option, as we'll get into.
Sure.
But you're absolutely right. You have to have a mechanism to make it legally enforceable. Otherwise, it's just a specification or a standard or something. Exactly. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So just to finish up on this slide, we've got our trust framework we've got our identity system surrounded by a trust framework, and that trust framework governs the operation of that identity system. So what we've done is we've tried to identify some of the key characteristics of a trust framework, just to give you a better sense of what this thing is and how it might be constructed. And so we've listed these 7 items here, which will also be explained further in a white paper that OIX will be releasing in the near future. But I'd like to go through each of these 7 characteristics to kind of give you a better sense of what this thing is and how it functions. So the first issue is scope. What's the scope of a trust? What's the scope of a trust framework? And I think the key takeaway here is that a trust framework relates to a single identity system. So each identity system will have its own trust framework, just like each credit card system has its own trust framework or set of rules, the Visa rules, the MasterCard rules, the Discover card rules, and so forth. Each trust framework will have its own, each identity system will have its own trust framework. And so we're looking at an environment where there will be many trust frameworks coexisting. And of course, one of the questions is how those might be made interoperable. And this is just a diagram, and we're going to get more into this same picture a little bit later. But just to emphasize, there's going to be multiple trust frameworks, one for each identity system that might be in existence in a given environment.
So I'm not sure. There were two legal terms that you used. One was, well, I don't know if they're legal, tethering. So to me, this explains the tethering of an identity system within a trust framework, within a set of laws and regulations, and so forth.
Correct. I'm not sure I used tethering, or at least I'm not sure.
This
I'm sorry.
young lady did.
Okay. Okay.
Well, the other term you used, which I'm not sure if it was yada yada yada. So I assume that had something to do with this. Thank you. Okay, back to you, Tom.
Okay. So what's the purpose of a trust framework? When you're setting out to write a trust framework, what are you trying to accomplish? And we think that there are basically two fundamental purposes, because the trust framework is designed to define and govern the operation of an identity system. So it both defines what the parameters are, who can play in the sandbox and what the rules are and those kinds of things, as well as its overall operation. It gets into the rights and responsibilities of the parties, but basically for two fundamental purposes. The first being to make sure that the identity system is operational, that it functions, and second, that it's trustworthy. And actually, if you go to the next slide, there's, I think, more detail on these two.
Oops, sorry about that.
There we go. So we start out with the requirement that a trust framework exists to support the operational functionality of the identity system, which is basically a very practical goal, to make sure it works so that the parties know what to do, know how to format the data, know what their responsibilities are, all just with the goal of making sure this identity system functions properly. But then there's a second goal, which deals with this whole question of trust. Merely functioning properly is not enough. We need to add additional rules or additional requirements in order to make sure that the system is sufficiently trustworthy for the purposes for which it is designed. So we can send emails back and forth in the clear, and they may get to the intended recipient, but they may not be trustworthy. So we may want to add, for example, requirements that they be encrypted or whatever. It's the same issue with respect to a trust framework and an identity system, is rules first to make it operational, and then over and above that to make sure it's trustworthy. And then, of course, as a layer on top of that, we also need to address the legal issues that are going to arise or could arise in the concept of a trust framework. So what are the legal rights and duties of the parties? How are we allocating liability in the event that there's problems? How are we making this whole thing enforceable? Those kinds of questions also need to be addressed.
If I, just to interject while you get ready to do this next piece, one of the things that from a business point of view that recommends trust frameworks is that it allows potential participants to see in advance exactly what they're signing up for. So I see my colleague from GE here. So if you think about GE systems as being systems of systems, each involving identity of people, places, or things, to have a pre-negotiated set of terms of reference, both the specifications that are and also legal enforceable, it allows suppliers, vendors, and other contractors to see in advance if they were to join a particular trust framework, what their list of requirements as well as liabilities would be. But I get ahead of ourselves. Tom, you want to keep going here?
So, okay, another characteristic we thought was worth focusing on was the form of a trust framework. What form does it take? And at its essence, of course, it's words on paper or words on a computer, but it's text. But it can take a variety of forms. It can be, for example, one big, huge document, such as the visa rules are for the credit card system. It can be many smaller documents. that are somehow related and incorporated in a contractual setting. It can be long or short. The trust framework for one of the early on identity systems known as IdenTrust runs about 4,000 pages. When you add it all together, it was split up amongst several documents, but it was quite long. In the credit card world, I think the Visa rules are about 1,200 pages long. You can also have a very short document, and if you do that, then there's a lot of issues you're not addressing, perhaps consciously, but in that case, then you're leaving those to general law. Yes?
I just have a very, very quick question.
I'm going to ask you to.
My question is, how is what you're describing here different from any contract that you might exist today where there are the terms and conditions of let's say you're going online and to use whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
How is what you're describing here different? That would be a big help.
Okay. How is it different from a contract? At its essence, in many situations, it will be a contract.
It is a contract.
But the key issue, I think, and the key challenge here is it's not a contract between two parties. It's a contract involving multiple parties, potentially thousands and thousands of parties.
Or you go online to do something.
Well, correct, but if you look at a terms of service, that's like LinkedIn. Everybody's agreeing with LinkedIn, so it's a series of bilateral contracts between you and LinkedIn, and Don and LinkedIn, and me and LinkedIn, right? With an identity system, and I think the credit card analogy is helpful here. So I get a credit card from Bank A, Don gets one from Bank B, you get one from Bank C, and then we can use it with any merchant we want to use it with anywhere in the world. They have a relationship with processor 1, processor 2, processor 3, and so forth. And everybody's got a relationship with somebody else. They don't all have a relationship directly with each other. And so we have to address that issue of avoiding the need to have a bilateral contract between every party, because as you increase the number of parties, you increase the number of required bilateral contracts by some huge factor of n squared, or there's actually a formula for that. So I'll get into shortly that whole question of how we make these enforceable. But at the end of the day, you're correct. It's in effect a contract. And so it's a multi-party contract, but not everybody's signing the same document necessarily. Okay? So where are we? Okay, so roles is another. One of the other things that is key for a trust framework is it's defining the roles that are involved in a particular identity system. So you've got standard roles like identity provider, relying party, user, and so forth. You may have many other roles. You may be subdividing, slicing, and dicing a number of these roles into sub-roles and so forth. I mean, that's all up to how you write the trust framework. But we think that the key thing when we look at the roles governed by a trust framework is to recognize that there are two basic categories of roles, what we're calling operational roles and then participating roles. So the operational roles would be like, for example, the role that actually writes the trust framework and updates it from time to time, or the role that involves certifying identity providers, for example, to verify that they're compliant with whatever requirements the trust framework imposes, roles that might involve, I don't know, arbitration of disputes between participating entities and so forth. So you've got those operational roles, and then primarily the trust framework will govern the participating roles, which will be, you know, the entity that's issuing identity credentials or doing identity proofing, authentication management, identity verification, so forth and so on, the relying party roles. And again, the trust framework is going to define what roles are required and how those roles are defined. The content of a trust framework, or what kind of rules are we talking about, we divide into a number of different sort of arbitrary groupings. But basically, we're talking about a set of specifications, rules, and agreements that address, we've come up with 4 general areas: business rules, technical rules, operational rules, and legal issues that are critical for the operation of the particular identity system with which you're working. Now, I think it's important to note that when you write the trust framework, you don't really have those 4 separate categories because there's a lot of overlap between them. I might write a technical rule that says, the identity provider has to issue credentials in accordance with a particular standard. And that has a technical component, but it also has a legal component because I've now just imposed an obligation on that particular role of identity provider to act in a certain way. So there's a fair amount of overlap, but for purposes of just kind of categorizing things, we think that's helpful. And this slide just gives some examples of the types of issues that might be addressed in a trust framework. We've kind of broken these out between 2 different boxes, one called business, technical, and operational rules, and the other called legal rules, just because the legal rules are easy to see that they're more from a legal perspective. But there's a lot of overlap between the 2. For example, under the business, technical, and operational rules, we have privacy standards, for example. Well, privacy is also a legal issue, as is security, the oval right underneath that. So there's a lot of overlap, but this will give you a general sense of the types of things that might be covered by a trust framework. The other thing I would note, you'll see those vertical ovals in the background there that say existing law. That's just to highlight the fact that whenever you write the rules of a trust framework, just like whenever you write any contract, you can't violate existing law. So we might write, for example, privacy standards, privacy rules for our trust framework, but of course they still need to comply with whatever the governing privacy law is. And then you'll see in the upper right of this picture the reference to a contract. That's what ties this all together in most cases, and that is that people need to agree to a contract to be bound by the portion of the trust framework rules that relate to their particular role. And then who writes the trust framework? Authorship and control. Who writes it and who updates it? We've seen a number of different approaches to this, but at the end of the day, somebody or some entity or some group needs to be responsible for writing and revising the trust framework rules from time to time. So that might be a separate legal entity that's set up for that purpose. And again, if I can refer to the credit card analogy, that's what Visa does, right? They write the rules. They have a process for how they update those rules, and I don't know, maybe the member banks get to vote. I'm not quite sure how that works. But in any event, in that case, you have a separate entity responsible for the rules. You might also have situations where an entity that's actually a participant in the trust framework, but is sort of an 800-pound gorilla, might be the one writing the rules for the trust framework. And that's certainly the case in the UK with their UK.gov Verify program, where the government is writing the rules that apply to the private sector. Google and Facebook are the same way. If you look at those identity systems, Facebook's writing the rules. You can opt in and join if you'd like, but you don't have a say in what those rules say. Some identity systems will also, for example, set up a committee of participants who will work on writing and updating the rules from time to time. And then lastly, we get to the question of enforceability. The rules are great, but if they're not enforceable, if they're not binding on the people and the entities that are participating in the trust framework, then they're really of no value. So we have to have a mechanism for making those rules enforceable. With private sector identity systems, that mechanism is a contract. And so every participant in the identity system typically needs to enter into a contract agreeing to be bound at least by those portion of the rules that apply to its role, and typically for the benefit of everybody else who is in the identity system, so that you deal with the multi-party issue. So that's typically the approach in the case of private sector systems, where there's going to be some type of a contract. It might be a simple one page or one sentence, I agree to be bound by the rules of the XYZ trust framework, and it may be as simple as that, or it can be a little bit more complex. But the goal is to have everybody bound to the same rules so that you don't have unique contracts for some participants and not for others. You want everybody to be bound, and you want everybody to know that everybody else is bound to the same rules. In the case of public sector identity systems, you see a mixed approach. In some public sector systems, like the one that the UK government is developing, the rules are also made binding by contract. And in that case, the identity providers sign a contract with the UK government to be bound by the rules. In other public sector identity systems, the rules are actually either a statute or a regulation that is adopted by the applicable government or government agency, and of course then they're enforceable by virtue of applicable law. And then just to kind of put a circle, I guess, around this whole trust framework concept, we want to just talk briefly about what law governs an identity system and where it comes from. Because we think it's important to kind of put in context the different sources of law or rules, if you will, and how they relate to each other. So we've really defined 3 different levels of law that are going to apply to any identity system. First is what we call general commercial law. This is the law that's been around for hundreds of years. Contract law, tort law, privacy law, personal injury law. You can go down the list. This is law that's out there. It's not written for identity systems, but it may apply in certain situations. The next level, or level 2, is what we call general identity management law. This is new. There's very little of this law, but there are a number of key efforts underway in order to develop this kind of law. The Virginia Electronic Identity Management Act is a good example of law of this type. It's a law written, in that case, primarily to address identity system liability issues, but it applies to all identity systems. It's written with identity systems in mind, and it applies to all identity systems within its scope. And then the third level is this contract-based trust framework, where the participants, the operators of an identity system, really try to write the key rules that apply to their particular system in the way in which they'd like their system to be governed, the way in which they'd like liability to be allocated, so forth and so on. And this is just a quick diagram to kind of illustrate the relationship between those 3 levels of law, with your general commercial law at the top, any identity management law in the middle, and then the multiple trust frameworks at the bottom. And actually, I think if you go to the next slide, this kind of illustrates, again, the same relationship where you've got that overriding general commercial law, your general identity management law, if it exists, and it may not exist in many cases, and then your identity system specific law, which is your trust frameworks. And I think it's important to recognize that a trust framework can be as comprehensive or as skimpy as you would like to make it. But to the extent you do not address issues in your trust framework, the default is going to be the general existing law, the commercial law most likely, in terms of resolving those issues. And then we want to just briefly touch on liability, because that's always a big concern with identity systems. And if you think about it, most of the participants in an identity system have concerns about liability. Identity providers, had probably the most talked about concern, which is if I incorrectly identify somebody and that costs somebody some money, what's my liability? But relying parties also have concerns about liability if they rely on a false credential or misuse personal information. Data subjects have concern about liability. If somebody steals my credential and uses it, am I liable for what they do? Questions like that are raised constantly. If we don't answer those questions in a trust framework, and actually I think you can go to the next slide there. Yeah, the default rule is we're going to look to general commercial law. General commercial law was not written with identity systems in mind, but it's going to have a number of principles which courts will turn to resolve those liability questions in the absence of any other authority. The problem you have with applying general commercial law to identity systems is, first of all, because it wasn't written with identity systems in mind, you're not really sure how that law is going to be applied to an identity system scenario. So you've got that kind of uncertainty going in that is sometimes unsettling. You've also got situations where the law just isn't designed to address certain types of situations that might come up. And in many cases, it might be applicable, but you may not like the result. And you may not be comfortable participating in an identity system with that result. So the primary solution here, in most cases, is to design your trust framework to allocate liability by contract in the way that is acceptable and appropriate for the type of identity system being used. Now, there are going to be some limitations in commercial law. There are some things where you cannot necessarily change the way the law allocates liability. And personal injury might be one of those kind of situations. But in most cases, the parties are free among themselves to decide what rules are going to apply and how they want to allocate liability. And so the trust framework is really the place to do that. That's what we encourage anyone setting up an identity system to do is, to the extent possible, figure out how the liability should be addressed in the context of the particular system, and then put that in the trust framework so that everybody is contractually agreeing to that particular approach and they know what it is up front. And I think, yeah.
So in the time remaining, we're going to have some time for questions. And for those of you that are watching this via video, there are hundreds of people in the audience waiting to ask questions about trust frameworks. But I wanted to give you a sense of the organization that I have the privilege of leading, the Open Identity Exchange. It began really at the request of the Obama administration to have a nonprofit, technology-agnostic industry organization representing the identity industry. And the OIX became the partner, or was to be the partner, with the US government, and eventually we became a partner of the UK government as they designed and deployed their gov.uk national verification system. But I wanted to give you, in the time remaining, just a sense of where this trust framework conversation has been and where it's going. I'm hoping that each of you will take away from this brief introduction just a sense of what this tool set might be useful for in whether you're a lawyer or an architect within a large company. So we started 2010, quite some time ago, with a number of industry notables all chipping in on the very first definition of a trust framework. And then we asked Tom Smedinghoff to again talk specifically about liability, which is the big bugaboo for so many identity systems, so many deployments of products and services in this space. The other thing we wanted to attend to was the notion of a trust mark. You've often seen this reference in discussions of identity systems. You've seen the trustee mark as an attempt to indicate trustworthiness for the general public on the internet. So we had a deep dive into the value and the efficacy and the cost effectiveness of trust marks. As I mentioned at the very outset, the paper that Tom has referred to several times is about to be published. We're actually using this as kind of a focus group to get questions like the ones that you asked, so that we can get this definition as crisp as possible. The other co-author of this paper is a woman in Europe, an expert on trust frameworks and identity schemes in the European Union. So together with Tom and I, we've put together this paper that we've talked about. We're then going to try and restate this in as technical a language as we can through an IETF model called the best current practice. The other thing that we're about to release is that we tried through working with our colleagues in the Light Test program is to capture every trust framework or trust scheme that we could find on the planet, put them in a spreadsheet, and begin to look for common denominators. Again, trying to suss out the value, the efficacy, and the optimal definition of a trust framework. In the near future, for those of you that are interested in this, we're going to be talking about trust frameworks and attribute exchanges, which is a topic of increasing interest about how different consortiums, different exchange-based models can distribute identity attributes in the context of a trust framework. The other piece that we're going to be publishing soon is self-certification. And we think that self-certification, like trust frameworks, are an important tool set for those of you that are designing systems at internet scale, systems that are big, systems that are complex, and systems that cross US, state, local, federal, as well as European and other regional authorities. So we want to be able to look at not only how traditional third-party certification helps build trust and enforcement in a trust framework, but we also want to look at the experience of some new models that we call self-certification and see how that fits into the fabric of a trust framework, the enforceability of the terms and requirements, both technical and legal, within the context of a trust framework describing an identity system. And lastly, we're going to be issuing a series of papers that talk about real live trust frameworks that are under construction today. The OIX has a grant from the European Union to look at cross-border banking services. So what kind of trust framework would be appropriate to someone opening a bank account in Italy, paying their taxes in Germany, and buying a car in the UK? So we're going to be looking at use cases like that, as well as others. The International Airline Transport Association is a member of our board, and they've got a challenging trust framework that they're trying to develop, which will look at a new way of allocating and distributing information about us as airline travelers throughout a system of competitive airlines, different regulatory schemes, different national laws that have to be followed. So in the case of the IATA, in the case of cross-border banking and others, we're going to be applying this definition of trust frameworks to those real needs that we have among our members and their partners to really exercise this, this new tool set called a trust framework. So this is an indicator of where we're going with this work. What we want to do is to expose this work in as many different venues as possible in Europe and here in the US. We have a specific workshop that we'll be returning to again this year as we did last, which kind of takes that cloud, the yada, yada, yada section, and really consults with international legal and policy experts in identity to make sure this notion of trust frameworks fits their perspectives, as well as that of our commercial partners. A great example of a trust framework is something that I'll just talk really quickly about is a new technical standard called OpenID Connect. This is the financial API. So it gives you a sense of how a framework adopted by bankers in the UK will be creating a trust framework that will talk about how this brand new financial API will help provide for account portability in the UK context, and we think in the UK and in Europe, in Europe and the US as well. I mentioned the open banking efforts, the International Airline Travel Association. Again, real world needs for global trust frameworks and complex identity systems at scale. And the last place is that we at the Open Identity Exchange have created a registry of trust frameworks. And we hope that that registry will offer some value for people that are building trust frameworks so that they can see, copy, and paste terms and conditions from relevant documents and other trust frameworks, and that we have something new in the identity ecosystem, a trusted place for trust frameworks, so that we can share learnings from one community of interest, one industry, one geographic region with others. Again, trying to attack what I think is the fundamental challenge of this conference, of this, this ecosystem, and it's a challenge shared by both lawyers who write legal code and contracts and engineers that write technical code and software and other instruments. We have to bring these two code bases together if we're going to synchronize the tools and rules of identity, and if we're going to provide the trust that really animates our professional lives, our personal lives in this identity ecosystem. So that's me. That's the end of our presentation. If there's any questions or comments, we'd be happy to entertain them now. Yes, ma'am, you can ask another question. Lawyers are not limited to one apiece.
Well, I thought it was great because I'm actually working on something that is a trust framework. So
Cool.
This is really cool. Yeah. And I was interested in your opinion of substantively how you would allocate liability among parties. And you can give me an example. I mean, of course, everybody wants to disclaim liability, or, you know, there is some typical language that you use when you do a contract in specific scenarios. But in this scenario, how would you allocate liability substantively?
One of the common approaches, and this is kind of the approach that's built into the Virginia legislation, is that you define a set of standards, if you will, for the conduct of the party in the trust framework. And you basically say, if you meet that standard, you don't have any liability. But if you don't meet the standard, then you're on the hook. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, you can slice and dice those things too. Yeah. Yeah. But it's up to you. You might do that, but then say, but no consequentials in any event. But again, it makes a difference whether, you know, this is a trust framework for borrowing library books, or this is a trust framework for accessing sensitive healthcare records, or this is a trust framework for transferring billions of dollars of funds, you know, and so you've got to look at the context. I mean, for example, in funds transfers, you know, Article 4A of the UCC has a liability allocation scheme depending on whether you used a commercially reasonable security procedure. So there's many different.
So basically, you're going to use you may use existing standards based on the party to which the liability would be attributed. Right?
That's absolutely one way to do it. Yeah.
And you say, okay,
yeah.
What's your role in this trust network, and what's your role? And if there's a breach here or there's a breach there, then there may be different types of liability that would.
Or you could take an approach like Regulation Z does with credit cards and say, for this role, there's no liability, or it's $50 maximum, you know. And it's really up to the parties, but that kind of, you know, did you follow the rules kind of approach seems to be a common one.
So, yes.
There's a question back there.
Hi, my name's Sean. So I think just following on from that, and also having attended the session before this on the personal data as an asset or a liability, what came up there is the issue of insurability, and I think that adding that dimension to this makes it a lot more sort of real and operational. So, so being able to move forward the insurability of these new arrangements around identity and personal data and trust frameworks would be really, I think, really an important contribution.
And I would just add, I mean, insurance can be an important component of this. One of the trust frameworks that we did many years ago involving web-based identification for websites required that the parties issuing the credentials had a particular level of insurance. And again, that's something that I think is well worth considering.
Hi, Steve Hutchinson from GE. In your presentation, you talked both about trust frameworks that had been initiated by both organizations of different parties, as well as some that were organized by a specific party. Which have you seen be more successful? I'm thinking about there's less friction. If there's one organization that feels passionately about it, that's starting a trust framework, that there would be less friction at the beginning, but possibly more friction as the network grows.
Which is more successful? I'm not sure, at least in my experience, that I can answer.
Well, let's talk about the most successful trust framework around,
yeah,
which is one that everybody has in their pocket, which is a credit card. In the credit card system, you saw it as a confluence of self-interest where merchants, financial institutions, and banks and their customers and consumers all wanted to take friction out of the payment system. So that took its time, but was a convergence of interests of different players in the payments world. I think what we're seeing in real time in the case of the International Airline and Travel Association is, in the face of new GDPR privacy requirements in Europe, new requirements from the Soviet Federation that all passenger data be housed on server in Russia, the airline global airline consortium that is IATA has to recreate a trust framework that will account for the new regulatory requirements, privacy law, as well as the importance of securing the transactions that are part of air travel. So we're seeing it come from different directions, from different communities of interest. We expect, our bet, and that of our member organizations, is that trust frameworks will become a more and more useful tool as identity systems cross borders and take on this internet scale level of adoption.
And I would just add, too, I think in some respects, it's less a function of who writes the trust framework, whether it's one party or multiple parties, and more a function of the business case that's being addressed and the urgency for resolving whatever the issues are, whether they be economic or regulatory or some other driver. Because I can think of trust frameworks written by one party, some that are very successful and some that have been total failures. And I'm not sure it's the author of the trust framework that was the issue there. So
thank you all very much. We appreciate the attention that you've paid. We understand this is not the sexiest topic on the schedule, but thanks again for your interest and participation.